Human societies have been built on codes stranger than fiction. This journey uncovers 41 unique cultural practices that fundamentally defined civilizations, revealing the secret logic behind rituals that shaped our world. You will discover how ancient traditions from every corner of the globe engineered social order, solved impossible problems, and answered humanity's deepest questions. What hidden purpose lay behind a warrior's leap from a 100-foot tower, and why would a widow choose to follow her husband into the flames? These are not random acts, but the very blueprints of society. By the end, you will see human history not as a dry timeline, but as a living tapestry of incredible ingenuity. What single practice do you think could hold a community together for 1,000 years? This cultural DNA is written in the language of ritual and story. It is the silent curriculum taught not in schools, but through the shared experiences of a community. Think of the stories told around a fire for generations, each retelling subtly reinforcing what the group values, what it fears, and what it believes is possible. These are not just tales, they are social blueprints. They teach children how to behave, they warn adults of social dangers, and they offer explanations for the mysteries of life and death. This living memory, carried in the cadence of a song, the steps of a dance, or the ingredients of a sacred meal, becomes the invisible boundary that defines us versus them. It forges a collective identity so powerful that it can outlast empires and outlive languages. To understand a society, then, you must look beyond its laws and its architecture. You must learn to read its rituals, and the first practice we will explore is one of the most dramatic and puzzling of all, a tradition that seems to defy every human instinct for survival. High on the wind-swept Tibetan plateau, where the earth is too hard for digging and wood too scarce for pyres, a different kind of ceremony unfolds. It is called Jeta, meaning giving alms to the birds. In this stark and beautiful landscape, a body is not interred but offered. A Rogyapa, a ritual specialist, performs the careful work, and vultures descend from the sky. To an outside eye, this might seem harsh, but within the framework of Vajrayana Buddhism, it is the ultimate act of compassion and practicality. The physical form is seen as an empty vessel once the spirit has departed, a temporary shell of no more inherent value than a shed piece of clothing. By giving the body back to the living creatures of the air, the deceased performs one final, magnificent act of charity. This sustains other beings and releases the soul from any attachment to its former physical home, allowing it to move more freely toward its next incarnation. The practice is a powerful, physical lesson in impermanence, a direct confrontation with the cycle of life and death that is both spiritually profound and environmentally essential. It solves an immediate, physical problem of how to handle the dead in a challenging land, while simultaneously answering a deep, philosophical question about our place in the natural world. This seamless fusion of stark necessity and profound belief is a recurring signature of the most enduring cultural practices. Far from the high Tibetan plateaus, in the warm seas of the Pacific, another intricate system of human connection was engineered not with the dead, but with the living. Across the coral atolls of Papua New Guinea, the Trobriand islanders perfected a ritual so powerful it bound scattered communities into a single, interdependent web for centuries. This was the Kula Ring. Imagine men launching long, elegant canoes into the open ocean, embarking on voyages that were both physically perilous and ritually sacred. Their mission was not to trade for food or tools, but to exchange objects of profound symbolic value. They carried two kinds of treasures: solava, long necklaces made of red shell that traveled in a slow, deliberate clockwise direction around the islands, and mwali, white shell armbands that journeyed counterclockwise. These were not mere decorations. They were the physical tokens of a grand social contract. A man did not own a kula valuable, he merely held it for a time, his status soaring with its temporary possession before he was obligated to pass it on to his kula partner on the next island. The most famous of these objects carried their own legends, their histories remembered and recited, each previous holder adding a chapter to a living story of alliance and friendship. This continuous ceremonial circuit was the true genius of the system. It was not an economy of barter but an economy of relationship. The trust and prestige built by exchanging these ritually moving objects then smoothed the way for all the practical business of life. When a canoe sailed on a kula journey, it also carried everyday goods for mundane trade. The partnerships forged through the kula prevented conflicts, secured political alliances, and created a safety net of social obligation across hundreds of miles of ocean. It was a society built not on what you kept but on what you passed along. This reveals a stunning truth that the most complex social and political structures can be woven from threads of pure symbolism. While the Kula Ring wove a social fabric across the sea, in the rugged lands of the Norse, another kind of network was forming, one built not on exchange but on collective voice. In the shadow of the fjords, within sacred groves and at ancient assembly fields, the Vikings perfected a system of governance that turned the raw energy of warriors and farmers into a force for law. This was the thing. Far from the chaotic image of pure raiding parties, these periodic gatherings were the true engine of Scandinavian society. Every free man, from the wealthiest chieftain to the humblest landowner, had the right to attend and speak at his local thing. Here, disputes over property, accusations of theft, and even blood feuds were brought into the open air to be settled not by a king's decree, but by the consensus of the community. The air would have been thick with the sound of reasoned argument and passionate oratory, a public debate where a man's reputation and his words carried immense weight. At the heart of this stood the law speaker, a living library of oral tradition. This individual did not create the law, he held it all in his memory, reciting it from a designated rock or mound so that the law of the land was a known, shared, and living entity for all to hear. This was a society fiercely protective of its personal freedoms, yet it understood that those freedoms could only exist within a framework of agreed-upon rules. A decision made by the thing, whether it was outlawing a troublesome individual or sanctioning a new trade route, carried the authority of the entire community. It was a place where honor could be restored without violence, where alliances between families were publicly sealed, and where the will of the people became the law of the land. How did such a system manage to hold together a society we so often associate with the axe and the longship? It shows us that the foundation of any lasting society is not just strength, but a shared belief in a process. The Thing system was the invisible architecture that prevented the Viking world from fracturing into endless, petty wars, proving that order can be a collective creation. Yet that collective voice could take many forms, and on the opposite side of the continent, power was demonstrated not through debate but through an astonishing act of giving. Along the misty shores of the Pacific Northwest, the great longhouses were the stage for a ceremony that turned economics into a form of theater. Inside, the air thick with smoke and the rhythm of drums, you would witness a scene that defies modern logic. A chief stands before his community and his rivals, presiding over mountains of woven blankets, piles of finely carved boxes, and even great shields of beaten copper, each one a named and legendary treasure. Then he begins to give it all away, or in an even more dramatic act, he might destroy it, breaking a copper plate worth the labor of years or pouring precious Eulachan oil onto the fire until the flames roar. This is the potlatch. Far from being an act of madness, this was the bedrock of social order for peoples like the Kwakwaka'wakwa and the Haida. A potlatch was held to cement a new title, to mourn a leader, or to celebrate the raising of a totem pole that would tell a family's story for generations. In this world, your status was not a fixed inheritance. It was a claim that had to be validated publicly, and the only way to prove your greatness was through magnificent, almost overwhelming generosity. The more wealth you could give away or ritually sacrifice, the more you demonstrated your capacity as a leader and your connection to the spirit world. This created a powerful, circulating economy where resources flowed from the most successful families back to the wider community, preventing hoarding and ensuring no one went without. The stories told, the songs sung, and the dances performed during a potlatch were the living archives of the people, a way of recording history and legal rights that was witnessed by all. It was a system where the ultimate power was not in possessing wealth, but in being able to transform it into honor and social cohesion. How could the deliberate destruction of property possibly create a more stable society? It reveals a profound truth that value is not an inherent quality of an object, but a story we all agree to believe in. This same transformation of sacrifice into honor, however, could take a far darker and more personal turn. In the historical context of the Indian subcontinent, the ideal of the Pativrata, the utterly devoted wife, was pushed to its most extreme and devastating conclusion in the practice known as Sati. A widow, by her own volition or more often under immense social duress, would ascend her husband's funeral pyre and lie beside his body as the flames consumed them both. While it is crucial to understand that this was never a universal practice across all of India or its history, and its prevalence is often debated, it became deeply romanticized within certain Rajput and Brahminical traditions. For its proponents, this was not seen as suicide, which was a spiritual sin, but as the ultimate act of wifely devotion. It was framed as a sacred duty that would burn away all the couple's accumulated sins, guaranteeing their joint salvation and eternal union in the afterlife. The woman who performed this act was elevated to the status of a goddess, with temples sometimes built in her memory. Yet behind this spiritual ideal lay a stark social machinery. A widow in that society often faced a life of extreme austerity and social isolation. She was considered inauspicious, her identity so completely merged with her husband's that his death rendered her a non-person, a burden on her own family's resources. The choice to become a Sati, therefore, was rarely a free one. It existed at the grim intersection of deep-seated religious belief, rigid patriarchal structures, and crushing economic pressure. How could a culture come to venerate an act that seems to us so fundamentally tragic? Sati forces us to confront the terrifying power of a cultural narrative, one that can convince an individual that their greatest act of worth is their own destruction, transforming profound social control into a celebrated ideal of purity and honor. It stands as a sobering reminder that the stories a society tells about itself can be used to enforce the most extreme of norms, blurring the line between devotion and coercion until they become one and the same. The line between devotion and coercion is a fragile one, but what if an entire civilization built its power not on human sacrifice, but on a conversation with the unseen world? In the smoky halls of the Shang dynasty court over 3,000 years ago, the future was not a mystery to be feared, but a text to be read. Royal diviners, the most trusted advisors to the king, would take the shoulder bone of an ox or the plastron of a turtle shell and carefully polish its surface. With a sharp tool, they would incise a question directly into the bone. Will the harvest be abundant? Is the coming week auspicious for launching a military campaign? Will the king's toothache subside? This was not random superstition. It was a formal, state-sponsored inquiry directed at the most powerful forces in the universe, the ancestral spirits. The bone was then subjected to intense heat, applied to hollows drilled into its back. With a sharp popping sound, cracks would radiate across the surface. To us, these lines might look like random fractures, but to the trained eye of the Shang diviner, they were a sacred script. The shape, the direction, the length of each crack formed a coded message, the direct answer from the ancestors. The diviner would then interpret the response, and often the entire transaction, the question and the verdict, would be carved right there next to the cracks. This is the miracle of the oracle bones. They were not merely ritual objects, they were the filing system of a kingdom, the meeting minutes between heaven and earth. The Shang kings understood a fundamental principle of power. To rule the people, you must first claim to understand the forces that govern their lives. By positioning themselves as the sole, legitimate intermediaries who could pose the questions and decipher the divine answers, they centralized both political and religious authority into one unassailable office. A bad harvest or a lost battle was not a failure of the king's policy. It was a misreading of the ancestors' will, a problem that could only be solved through more divination, further cementing the ritual's necessity. But the true, unintended legacy of this practice was the writing itself. Those inscriptions are our earliest robust evidence of the Chinese written language, a direct window into the concerns, the bureaucracy, and the worldview of a foundational civilization. This relentless quest for control over the unknown did not just prop up a dynasty. It actively spurred the development of a writing system that would bind Chinese culture together for millennia, turning a ritual of crackling bone into the very bedrock of historical record. But that Shang king, interpreting cracks in a bone, was not the only one to master the language of power. Far from the ancient courts of China, in the rugged, mist-shrouded highlands of Papua New Guinea, a different kind of leader was born, not from royal bloodline, but from pure, calculated generosity. Here, authority was not inherited, it was gifted into existence by a figure known as the Big Man. He does not command armies, he commands loyalty, and his weapon of choice is the pig. His stage is the Moka, a ceremonial exchange that is the very engine of the highland political world. At its heart, the Moka is a competition in giving. It is not a simple trade or a balanced repayment. The entire system is built on a brilliant, relentless escalation. If a rival gifts you 10 prized pigs, you are socially obligated to return the favor, but not with just 10 pigs. You must give back 15 or 20 or even more. The goal is to give a gift so immense, so publicly magnificent, that the original giver is placed in a state of permanent social debt. This creates a cycle of obligation that can span years, even generations. A big man aiming for the ultimate prestige does not just accumulate wealth. He becomes a master conductor of a vast economic network, calling in favors, pooling resources from his own followers, and amassing a staggering treasury. The moment of the Moka ceremony is pure theater. Imagine a clearing in the highlands charged with anticipation. The big man stands before his community and his rival, surrounded by a vast fortune. There are not just hundreds of pigs squealing and decorated, but also modern symbols of wealth like stacks of cash and even trucks, all destined not for his own use but for giving away. With each gift presented, his status soars while his rival is quietly, publicly shamed by the sheer weight of the generosity they now owe. This is how wars are prevented and dominance is established without a single spear being thrown. The Moka motivates everything. It drives agricultural production as men work to grow more sweet potatoes to feed more pigs to gain more prestige. It forges and tests alliances, binding communities together in a complex web of credit and obligation. It is a non-violent battlefield where influence is won not by taking lives, but by giving away property. The Moka reveals a stunningly sophisticated grasp of soft power, a deep understanding that the most binding chains are not forged of iron, but of gratitude and honor. It makes you wonder, in our own world of financial transactions, what invisible economies of social credit are we all participating in without even knowing it? That same transformation of property into social power finds a stunning parallel in a system where the land itself holds the story. The vast, sun-baked continent of Australia is not an empty wilderness to its Aboriginal peoples. It is a living library, its every rock, waterhole, and mountain ridge a paragraph in the epic tale of the dreaming. The dreaming is not a time that ended long ago. It is the eternal, creative era when ancestral beings, part human, part animal, part spirit, emerged from a formless earth and wandered across the land. With every step they took, every battle they fought, every song they sang, they shaped the world we see today. A particular rock formation might be the body of a great kangaroo ancestor. A river might trace the path where a rainbow serpent carved its way through the plains. The landscape is the permanent, physical record of these events, a sacred text written not on paper, but in the very contours of the earth. But how do you navigate such a text? How do you remember a story so vast it covers an entire continent? You follow the songlines. A songline is a pathway of knowledge, a melodic map that charts the journey of a specific ancestral being across the country. Each landmark along the route is encoded within a sequence of songs, a series of precise musical phrases that describe the creation of that specific feature. To travel across the land is to sing the land into being, note by note. An elder walking from one waterhole to the next is not just taking a journey. They are ritually reenacting the original creative act, singing the world into existence with every step. This practice is a brilliant fusion of geography, navigation, spirituality, and law. The songs are not just directions, they are title deeds. Knowing the songs for a particular stretch of country and having the right to sing them establishes your kinship ties and your sacred responsibility to care for that land. They encode which plants are edible, where to find water in a drought, and the moral codes that govern how people should interact with each other and with the environment. This is a knowledge system that has sustained human life and cultural memory for over 60,000 years, making it the oldest continuous culture on our planet. It presents a radically different way of knowing. We often see land as a resource to be owned and exploited. In this worldview, you do not own the land. You belong to it, and your most sacred duty is to sing its story, to keep the world alive through memory and ritual. How many maps in our own world could tell us not only where we are, but who we are and what we are meant to become? The ancient Greeks understood that the most serious ideas could emerge from the most relaxed of settings. Step into the andron, the exclusive men's dining room of a wealthy Athenian home. Here the air is thick with the scent of wine and olive oil, and the soft glow of lamplight flickers across the faces of a dozen men, each reclining on a cushioned couch. This is the Symposium, an institution so central to Greek life that its name literally means drinking together. But this was no mere party. It was a carefully choreographed ritual of the mind and spirit. The wine, always mixed with water in a large bowl called a crater, was a tool for lowering inhibitions, not for losing control. A master of the feast, the symposiarch, was elected to dictate the strength of the drink and the pace of the evening, ensuring the conversation remained sharp and purposeful. What unfolded on these couches was a performance of elite masculinity, a space where a young man learned how to argue, how to compose poetry, how to hold his wine, and how to navigate the complex social and political networks that defined his world. It was here, in this intimate, all-male setting, that the very foundations of Western thought were forged. Philosophers like Plato and Xenophon immortalized these gatherings in their writings, using the dialogue form to capture the essence of Socratic questioning. Ideas about justice, love, virtue, and the ideal state were not debated in sterile lecture halls, but argued passionately between sips of diluted wine, accompanied by the gentle strum of a lyre. The Symposium was also a political crucible. Alliances were formed, strategies were whispered, and the fate of the city-state could be subtly influenced by the bonds of friendship and obligation forged over the shared cup. It formalized a specific kind of relationship, the bond between an older Erastes and a younger Eromenos, which was seen as a vital channel for the transmission of knowledge, virtue, and political patronage. How could such a social event be so culturally productive? The Symposium reveals a profound truth, that the architecture of leisure is just as important as the architecture of work. By creating a dedicated space for free-flowing conversation, governed by its own unique rules, the Greeks turned socializing into a primary engine for intellectual and political innovation, proving that culture is often built not in the public assembly, but in the private room next door. That same sense of belonging to a fixed place in the world, so beautifully expressed in the Songlines, could also be engineered into a social structure of breathtaking rigidity. For centuries, the rhythm of life in countless Indian villages was not governed by cash, but by a complex web of hereditary duty known as the Jajmani system. This was the living, breathing economic engine of the Varna caste structure, a self-contained world where every family was born into a specific role, tied for life to other families in a chain of mutual obligation. A landowning family of a higher caste, the Jajman, did not pay a barber with coins. Instead, the barber's family, generation after generation, would provide their grooming services to the Jajman's household. The potter would supply all the clay vessels needed for cooking and storage. The blacksmith would maintain the farming tools. The washerman would clean the linens. And at the harvest, each of these service families received a predetermined traditional share of the grain. This was not a one-time transaction. It was a permanent, inherited relationship, a social contract written at birth. The system created a profound interdependence. The landowner relied on the skills of a dozen different specialist families to maintain his household and farm, while each service caste family, the Kamans, received a guaranteed portion of the agricultural surplus, insulating them from the direct whims of the market. It was a form of social security woven directly into the fabric of the community, yet this security came at a steep cost. Your identity was your occupation, and your occupation was your destiny. The system meticulously enforced social hierarchy and purity laws through these very exchanges. A Brahmin family might have a relationship with a water carrier from a specific caste considered pure enough to handle their water, but not with a tanner who worked with animal hides. The entire village was thus mapped not just by geography, but by an invisible lattice of who could serve whom and who could accept what from whose hands. This intricate economy reveals a startling truth. A society can engineer remarkable stability by embedding deep inequality into a framework of mutual need. The Jajmani system did not just assign jobs, it assigned meaning, purpose, and a place in the cosmic order, weaving economics and social identity so tightly together that they became a single, unbreakable thread. It makes you wonder, in our own fluid, market-driven world, what invisible hierarchies and unspoken obligations still bind us to our own stations in life. While the Jajmani system wove identity into the rigid fabric of occupation, another tradition sought identity through a direct encounter with the void. On the vast, open grasslands of North America, a young Lakota person stands alone at the edge of their world. They have left the warmth and safety of the communal tipi, carrying nothing but a pipe and a blanket, embarking on a journey known as Hanbulsaya, crying for a vision. This is not a punishment but a sacred summons. At the pivotal moment of transitioning to adulthood, the individual is deliberately stripped of every comfort, every social distraction. They travel to a remote, elevated place, a hilltop where the only sounds are the wind and their own prayers. For days, they will fast from both food and water, a physical ordeal that purges the body and sharpens the mind, making it receptive to messages from the unseen world. In this state of profound vulnerability, they cry out, not in despair, but in a heartfelt plea for guidance, for a sign, for a purpose. The goal is a dream or a vision, a direct communication from the Wakan Tanka, the Great Spirit, or a specific guardian spirit. This is not a passive waiting game. It is an active, courageous pursuit of a relationship with the sacred, a solitary quest to discover the unique medicine, the personal power, that the individual is meant to bring back to their people. The vision that arrives is never a simple answer. It is a dense, symbolic tapestry that must be interpreted with the help of a holy man. A visitor might appear in the form of a buffalo, an eagle, or a bear, each carrying its own strengths and teachings. The vision might grant a personal song to be sung in times of need, a design for a shield, or a set of instructions for a specific role. One person might receive the calling to become a healer, another the strategic mind of a leader, another the fierce heart of a protector. The entire community understood that its collective strength depended on the diverse gifts discovered by its members on these lonely hilltops. How could a culture that valued community so highly place such emphasis on a solitary struggle? The Vision Quest reveals a stunning cultural insight that the strongest group is not a uniform mass, but a tapestry woven from threads of unique, personally revealed purpose. It balanced a deep communal ethos with a radical respect for individual spiritual revelation, ensuring that every person's life was not just a role to be filled, but a story to be lived, a song received directly from the universe itself. That solitary quest for a personal vision stands in stark contrast to a world where purpose was not discovered, but dutifully inscribed upon the soul. In the rigid social order of feudal Japan, the samurai class lived by an unwritten law, a code that wove the threads of life and death into a single, unbreakable fabric of honor. This was Bushido, the way of the warrior. It was far more than a set of battlefield tactics. It was a complete spiritual and ethical framework, a relentless pursuit of moral perfection that governed a samurai from his first sword stroke to his final breath. The code demanded absolute loyalty to one's lord, a fidelity so profound it superseded all other ties, even to family. It required relentless martial mastery, not for the sake of brutality, but as a form of disciplined self-cultivation. It celebrated frugality and sincerity, and it held honor as the only true possession more valuable than life itself. This philosophy was a powerful synthesis of influences. From Zen Buddhism, it drew the mental clarity and fearlessness in the face of mortality necessary for combat. From Confucianism, it adopted the hierarchical respect and emphasis on righteous conduct. And from Shinto, it inherited a deep reverence for nature and the ancestors. This blend transformed the samurai from a mere soldier into a cultured aristocrat, expected to find beauty and discipline in the peaceful arts as much as in the martial ones. He might spend his morning in lethal sword practice and his afternoon composing a delicate haiku or performing the precise, meditative movements of the tea ceremony. Each act was a different expression of the same unwavering focus and respect for form, but this devotion to honor had one ultimate, terrifying expression. Seppuku, or ritual disembowelment, was the samurai's final recourse. It was not an act of despair, but a calculated, ceremonial affirmation of his code. A warrior might choose this path to atone for a grave failure, to avoid the shame of capture by an enemy, or even as the ultimate form of protest against a lord's unjust decision. Performed with a precise, agonizing cut across the abdomen, often with a trusted friend standing by to deliver the final, merciful decapitation, seppuku was the ultimate proof that the samurai's will was master of his flesh. He actively chose the manner and moment of his death, transforming what could have been a passive defeat into an active, honorable exit. How could a culture come to venerate such a painful end? Bushido demonstrates that when a philosophy makes honor more real than life itself, death ceases to be a threat and becomes a tool. It was this fearsome commitment that cemented the samurai's authority for centuries, proving that the most absolute power resides not in the sword, but in the unbreakable will of the one who holds it. The samurai's unwavering loyalty to a single lord finds a fascinating echo in the very heart of another empire, though the bonds there were multiplied and woven into the fabric of daily life. In the bustling, crowded streets of ancient Rome, the morning air was punctuated by a very specific sound, the respectful greeting of a client to his patron. This was the Clientela system, a hereditary network of obligation that was the true engine of Roman society. Imagine a powerful senator, a patronus, emerging from his home at dawn to find a crowd of his clients, free men of lower social standing, waiting to pay their respects. This was not a casual meeting. It was a formal, ritualized exchange rooted in the sacred concept of fides, a powerful blend of trust, loyalty, and good faith. The patron acted as a social and legal guardian. He provided loans in times of need, represented his clients in court, and distributed the daily sportula, a small basket of food or money that could mean the difference between eating and going hungry. In return, the clients were the patron's social army. They bolstered his public reputation simply by their numbers, accompanying him through the forum in a visible display of his influence. When an election was held or a crucial vote was taken, the patron could rely on the unwavering support of this entire bloc. Their voices and their votes became an extension of his own political will. This was a quasi-familial bond, often passed from father to son, creating vast vertical networks that stretched from the poorest plebeian to the most powerful senator. For a clever and ambitious client, this relationship was a ladder. Faithful service could lead to a lucrative business opportunity, a favorable marriage for his daughter, or a minor political office for his son. The system offered a pathway for social mobility, but it was a pathway built entirely within a framework of dependency and deference. It institutionalized personal relationships, turning friendship and loyalty into a currency that could be banked, invested, and spent. The entire Roman political machine, which conquered and administered a vast empire, was ultimately powered by these intricate, personal chains of mutual obligation. How could such an informal web of favors possibly hold an empire together? It reveals that the might of Rome was not just in its legions, but in the invisible, daily reaffirmation of a million small loyalties, proving that the strongest social fabric is often woven one handshake at a time. Within the intimate, steam-filled darkness of the sweat lodge, every breath is a prayer. This dome of willow branches and heavy blankets, used by countless indigenous nations from the Lakota to the Cree, is far more than a simple sauna. It is a sacred microcosm, a deliberate return to the womb of Mother Earth. The ceremony begins with the fire keeper heating grandfather stones, large lava rocks, in a sacred fire outside the lodge. Each stone is acknowledged as a living elder, holding the wisdom of the earth and the fire's transformative power. These glowing stones are then carefully brought into the center of the pitch-black lodge, placed in a small pit, and the door flap is sealed, plunging the participants into total darkness. As water is poured over the stones, a wave of intense, purifying heat envelops everyone. The hiss of the steam is the first sound in a symphony of devotion. In this profound sensory deprivation, there is no distraction, no outside world. There is only the heat, the darkness, and the shared human vulnerability. The lodge leader guides the ceremony through typically 4 rounds, each one representing a different aspect of life or a cardinal direction. In each round, a sacred pipe may be passed, prayers are offered aloud, traditional songs are sung, and teachings are shared. Participants are encouraged to release their burdens into the steam, to let the heat burn away illness, grief, and spiritual impurities. The physical ordeal of enduring the heat becomes a metaphor for facing life's challenges with courage and humility. It is a symbolic death of the old self, followed by a rebirth as you emerge from the lodge, cleansed and renewed, back into the cool air of the world. This ritual is often a necessary preparation for other significant ceremonies, like the Vision Quest, because it creates the state of purity and focus required to approach the sacred. It binds the community together in a shared experience of suffering and release, reinforcing the core values of gratitude, respect, and interconnectedness. The Sweat Lodge demonstrates that true healing is never just physical or just spiritual, but a holistic process where the community holds space for the individual to be remade. How many of our modern ailments could be soothed by such a powerful, collective embrace of heat, song, and shared intention? That same yearning for a tangible existence beyond death found its ultimate expression not in a solitary vision, but in a meticulous, state-sponsored science. In the embalmer's tent, set back from the bustling life of the Nile, the air was thick with the scent of resin and the hum of incantation. Here, the ancient Egyptians performed a 70-day ritual so precise it became the very foundation of their civilization. This was mummification, and it was far more than a funeral custom. It was a physical and spiritual operation designed to cheat decay and guarantee eternal life. The Egyptians believed a person was a composite of elements, chief among them the Ka, or life force, and the Ba, the personality or soul. For these to survive and reunite after death, they needed a permanent home, a recognizable body. The process began with the removal of the internal organs through a small incision. The brain, considered unimportant, was drawn out through the nose and discarded. But the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were carefully preserved, each organ placed in its own decorated canopic jar under the protection of a specific deity. The empty body cavity was then purified and packed with natron, a special salt mine from the desert. This was the key ingredient. For 40 days, the body lay buried in this salt, which drew out all moisture, leaving the skin and muscles desiccated but intact. After this, the hardened natron packets were removed, and the shrunken form was anointed with precious oils and resins that acted as a natural antibacterial sealant, giving the skin a dark, glossy appearance. Then began the final, sacred act of wrapping. Dozens of yards of fine linen strips, often inscribed with spells, were wound around the body, with amulets and jewels tucked between the layers to provide magical protection for the journey ahead. Every single step, from the first cut to the final knot, was accompanied by the recitation of spells from the Book of the Dead, a guidebook to navigating the perils of the underworld. This was not a secret rite but a massive, organized industry. It required priests to perform the rituals, artisans to craft the sarcophagi and canopic jars, and laborers to mine the natron and weave the linen. The cost was staggering, making a proper mummification a powerful symbol of status, a luxury that reinforced the social hierarchy from the pharaoh down to the wealthy elite. For 3,000 years, this belief in a corporeal afterlife dictated the rhythm of Egyptian life, directing the flow of wealth, inspiring the creation of monumental art and architecture, and turning the fear of death into the most powerful organizing principle a society has ever known. While the Egyptians preserved the body for an afterlife, the Polynesians navigated the world of the living with a system designed to protect its very life force. Across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, the concept of Tapu was the invisible boundary that held entire island societies together. The word, which gives us our modern taboo, did not mean something merely forbidden. It meant sacred, set apart, and charged with a dangerous spiritual power. Everything in the Polynesian world, from a high chief to a freshly planted field, possessed a certain amount of mana, an impersonal supernatural force that was the source of effectiveness and prestige. Tapu was the protective fence placed around anything with high levels of this mana to prevent it from being contaminated or weakened by the common, the knower. A chief, believed to be a direct descendant of the gods, was so tapu that his very shadow falling on a commoner could be considered a dangerous transgression. He could not touch food with his own hands, requiring a servant to feed him, lest his sacredness render the food inedible for others. A sacred temple platform, a mari, was intensely tapu, and only priests could enter its precincts. But this system was far more than a religious observance. It was a brilliant form of divine law that governed every aspect of life with incredible efficiency. A fishing ground might be declared tapu for a season, a conservation method that ensured fish stocks would replenish themselves. Certain fruits could be declared tapu until a formal harvest ceremony was performed, preventing premature picking and guaranteeing a communal, organized distribution. The punishment for breaking a tapu was not a fine from a human authority. It was believed to be automatic and supernatural, a kind of spiritual poison that would bring sickness, misfortune, or death upon the transgressor, and sometimes their entire family. This belief created a powerful internal police officer in the mind of every individual. You did not need a guard watching the restricted fishing cove because the fear of the unseen consequence was far more potent. The system ingeniously linked personal conduct to cosmic order. By obeying the tapu, you were not just following a rule, you were actively maintaining the health of your community and the favor of the gods. It was a society where environmental sustainability and social hierarchy were not matters of policy, but articles of sacred faith. How many modern laws could claim such a deep and unshakable psychological hold? This was governance woven from the threads of the spirit world, proving that the most effective rules are those that people believe in their bones. A defendant in a medieval court faced a choice with no good options. He could confess, or he could place his hand directly into a pot of boiling water to retrieve a small, heavy stone. This was the trial by ordeal, a legal process that seems like pure madness to the modern mind. Yet within the worldview of the time, it was a perfectly rational and even merciful alternative. In a world without forensic science, detective work, or reliable witnesses, how could a judge possibly discern the truth in a case of he said, she said? The answer was to bypass human fallibility entirely and appeal to the one infallible judge, God himself. The entire ordeal was framed as a solemn religious ceremony. The accused would first undergo a period of fasting and prayer. A priest would bless the iron or the water, consecrating the elements and calling upon the divine to manifest its will. The community would gather not as a bloodthirsty mob, but as a congregation witnessing a sacred appeal to a higher power. When the defendant carried the red-hot iron for 9 paces, his hand was then bandaged and examined 3 days later. If the wound was clean and healing, it was a sign of God's protection, proving his innocence. If it was festering, God had judged him guilty. Similarly, in the trial by cold water, the bound individual was cast into a pond or river. Sinking was a sign that the pure water had accepted an innocent soul, and he would be quickly pulled out. Floating, however, meant the water had rejected a sinner, and that was proof of guilt. The underlying logic was unshakable for a society steeped in faith. God would not allow an innocent person to be terribly harmed in a ritual conducted in his name. The ordeal was not a test of pain tolerance, but a direct channel to divine verdict. This practice reveals a desperate need for closure and social resolution. A community could not allow a murder or a theft to go unadjudicated, as the resulting feuds and suspicions could tear it apart. The trial by ordeal provided a definitive, public answer that everyone was compelled to accept. It transferred the heavy burden of judgment from a human lord, who could be accused of bias or corruption, to the ultimate authority of heaven. The very brutality of the method was its strength, creating a consequence so fearsome that it was believed only divine intervention could save you. How could such a system possibly function without constant injustice? Some historians suggest the psychological pressure alone produced telling results, with the guilty more likely to confess rather than face the fire or water. Others point to the control priests may have had in interpreting the healing process. It was a system built not on evidence, but on a collective, ironclad belief in a universe where God actively intervened in the smallest details of human affairs. This fusion of faith and law, however terrifying, was a mechanism for maintaining order in a world where truth was often just a matter of opinion. A society's survival can hinge on its ability to transform its fiercest protectors into its wisest leaders. In the sun-scorched savannas of East Africa, the Maasai people perfected this alchemy through the Unoto ceremony, a profound ritual that guides the entire warrior class across the threshold to adulthood. For years, the young Moran have lived apart from their villages, dwelling in isolated warrior camps known as maniatas. Their lives have been dedicated to mastering the skills of the spear, protecting the precious herds of cattle from predators and rivals, and forging an unbreakable brotherhood. These warriors, with their bodies coated in red ochre and their hair grown long and braided into intricate styles, are the embodiment of strength and pride. They are the living shield of the community, but their very power also makes them a potential source of instability. The Unoto is the carefully orchestrated solution. The multi-day ceremony begins with the warriors returning from the bush, a river of red and strength flowing back into the heart of the community. The climax of the ritual is a moment of deep symbolic power. Each warrior sits before his mother, the woman who gave him life, and she now takes a razor and shaves off his long, red-dyed hair. This single act is a powerful renunciation. The flowing locks were the ultimate badge of the Moran, a public declaration of his fierce, untamed identity. To have them removed by his mother signifies a return to the fold, a shedding of that singular warrior persona. He is no longer just a protector, he is becoming a builder. With his head bare, he is then blessed by the circle of elders, the men who once sat where he now sits. This blessing is not just a prayer, it is a transfer of responsibility. The young man is now a junior elder. He gains the right to marry, to start a family, to own cattle, and to participate in the councils that guide the community. The ceremony is the essential gear in the clockwork of the Maasai age set system, a social structure that organizes men into generational cohorts that move through life stages together. By mandating this collective transition, the Maasai prevent a common human problem, the stagnation of a powerful warrior class that refuses to relinquish its youth and its privileges. It ensures that the energy and courage of young men are channeled into defense when needed, but are then systematically redirected into governance and wisdom when the time is right. How does a community convince its strongest members to voluntarily lay down their symbols of power? The Unoto demonstrates that the most successful rituals do not break the human spirit, they redirect its flow, turning the raw force of a warrior into the steady strength of an elder, and in doing so, guaranteeing the continuity of the entire society. Locked in a tiny, Spartan cell for 3 days and 2 nights, a young man in imperial China held his entire future at the tip of a brush. This was the Keju, the imperial examination, and it was the most daunting mental marathon the world had ever devised. For more than 1,300 years, this system was the single gateway to power, bypassing the old aristocracy to create a new elite born not of blood, but of ink and memory. The path to the examination halls was open, in theory, to almost any man willing to dedicate his life to study. He would first have to master an immense canon of Confucian classics, committing thousands of pages of ancient philosophy to heart. He learned to compose poetry in strict, elegant forms and to write 8-legged essays, a highly structured argument that demanded flawless calligraphy and unwavering adherence to orthodox interpretation. The examination itself was an ordeal of isolation and endurance. Candidates were sealed into individual cubicles, just large enough for a desk and a sleeping board with a bucket for sanitation. Guards patrolled to prevent cheating, and the only items allowed were brushes, ink, and food. Here, in this claustrophobic space, a man's intellect was put under unimaginable pressure. He had to produce pages of elegant, coherent text on questions of governance and ethics, his handwriting steady even as exhaustion set in. Success was astronomically rare, with only a tiny fraction of candidates passing the highest level to earn the coveted Jinshi degree. But for those who succeeded, the rewards were immense. They entered the prestigious scholar gentry class, the mandarins, and were appointed as magistrates, administrators, and advisors across the empire. A poor farmer's son, through sheer intellectual effort, could rise to govern a province and advise the emperor himself. This created a powerful fiction of perfect meritocracy, a dream that talent and hard work alone could lift you to the highest echelons of society. The true genius of the system, however, was ideological. By making the Confucian classics the sole curriculum, the state ensured that every single official, regardless of his regional background, shared the same core values. They all believed in the same hierarchical social order, the same virtues of filial piety and loyalty to the emperor, and the same model of benevolent, paternalistic rule. This created a remarkably stable and uniform administrative culture that held a vast and diverse empire together for centuries. The examination system became the central nervous system of Chinese civilization, directing its brightest minds into a lifetime of service to the state. It forged a governing class united by a common education and a common purpose, proving that the most effective way to control a kingdom is not with an army, but with a standardized test. A man's honor was his life, and an unavenged killing was a wound that festered across generations. In the Viking world, the blood feud was not a breakdown of law, it was the law, a grim obligation passed from father to son. If your kinsman was slain, your family's standing demanded a response, a retaliatory killing that would, in turn, demand another from the other side. This cycle could plunge entire regions into a state of perpetual, low-level war, draining communities of their strongest men. Yet, woven directly into this fabric of violence was its antidote, a brilliant legal innovation called weregild, the man price. This was not a bribe or a fine. It was a meticulously calculated valuation of a person's life, set by the law and debated at the Thing Assembly. The price was a direct reflection of social standing. The weregild for a landowning freeman was a significant sum, while the price for a jarl or chieftain was astronomically higher, and that for a thrall, a slave, was negligible. The entire system was designed to make vengeance a choice, not an inevitability. When a killing occurred, the community and the local chieftains would pressure both families to negotiate. The offending family would offer the legally defined weregild, a payment in silver, weapons, or cattle, to the grieving family. To accept this payment was a profound and public act. It required the victim's family to swallow their pride and declare before their entire community that the debt of honor had been paid. The silver was not blood money. It was a symbolic replacement for blood, a tangible representation of restored balance. Accepting it legally and ritually ended the feud, forbidding any further retaliation. This created a crucial off-ramp from the cycle of violence. A poorer family, unable to withstand the loss of a breadwinner, might accept the weregild for sheer survival. A more powerful family might accept it to avoid a costly and uncertain war. The system acknowledged the primal drive for vengeance but channeled it into a transaction that preserved social peace. It showed a society painfully evolving, trying to balance the ancient, visceral code of the warrior with the pragmatic needs of a growing, settled community. How does a culture learn to place a price on a life, and in doing so, begin to value peace over pride? The weregild was that fragile, necessary bridge between the law of the axe and the rule of law. The crashing waves of the Indian Ocean meet a river of saffron and white on the beaches of Bali. This is the eve of Nyepi, the day of silence, and the island is not quieting down. It is preparing through a magnificent collective roar of devotion. The Melasti ceremony unfolds as a vibrant, moving tapestry. Thousands of Hindus, dressed in their most brilliant traditional attire, form long, orderly processions that snake from village temples down to the sea, to sacred lakes, to any source of life-giving water. They are not empty-handed. At the head of each procession, carried with immense reverence upon the shoulders of the faithful, are the pralinga, the sacred objects from the village temple. These are not mere statues or artifacts. To the Balinese, these objects are the temporary, physical vessels for the gods themselves, the points where the divine condescends to touch the material world. The destination is always the water, for the ocean and lakes are believed to hold amrita, the elixir of immortal life. The core belief is that during Melasti, the gods descend into the waters to bathe, absorbing this spiritual essence and drawing out the accumulated spiritual filth, the negative energies that have contaminated the world over the past year. As the priests chant and the people pray, the sacred objects are ritually washed in the water. This is not just a cleansing of dust and grime, it is a profound purification of the universe itself. The participants, immersing themselves in the same sacred waters, are also cleansed, their own souls scrubbed of impurities as they prepare to face the new year. This entire breathtaking spectacle is the ultimate expression of the Balinese Hindu worldview, which hinges on the constant maintenance of balance between two parallel realities: Sakala, the visible world we perceive, and Niskala, the unseen spiritual realm. Melasti is the community's direct, physical intervention into this cosmic balance. It is their sacred duty to actively purify not just their own souls, but the entire cosmos, rolling back the tide of spiritual decay so that the world can be reborn fresh and harmonious with the dawn of Naipe. How many of our own New Year's preparations involve such a direct, collective responsibility for the state of the universe itself? The rhythm of the medieval town was not set by a clock, but by the sound of a hammer on an anvil and the scent of rising bread. In the narrow, cobbled streets of Europe, your identity and your livelihood were forged within the walls of a single, powerful institution, the guild. This was not a simple trade union. It was a comprehensive system that controlled the very quality of life, from the clothes you wore to the beer you drank. A guild was an association of craftsmen or merchants, like the weavers, the bakers, or the goldsmiths, who banded together to create a monopoly over their specific trade. They set the prices for goods to prevent cutthroat competition. They enforced strict production standards, ensuring that a yard of cloth purchased in one shop was identical in quality to a yard purchased in another. This created a world of remarkable stability and trust for the consumer, where the guild's seal on an item was a guarantee of its worth, but the guild's power reached far beyond the marketplace. It was a surrogate family, a social safety net for its members. If a master craftsman fell ill or died, the guild would provide for his widow and children. It organized feasts, settled disputes between members, and cared for the elderly who could no longer work. The path to becoming such a master was long and arduous, a carefully controlled journey that began in childhood. A young boy, perhaps only 12 years old, would be apprenticed to a master for a term of 7 years. He lived in the master's home, learning not just the craft, but the manners and morals of the trade. After this, he became a journeyman, free to travel from town to town, working for different masters to hone his skills and learn new techniques. His final test was the creation of his masterpiece, a single piece of work judged by the guild masters to be of flawless quality and technical perfection. Only if it passed this rigorous inspection would he be admitted as a master himself, with the right to open his own shop and train his own apprentices. This system was the bedrock of urban social hierarchy, creating a clear path from lowly apprentice to respected, propertied master. The guilds were also pillars of the community's spiritual life. They funded the construction of magnificent chapels within the great cathedrals, their members marching together under their own banners in religious processions and performing mystery plays that brought biblical stories to life for the common people. How did such a tightly controlled system manage to foster the innovation that led to the Renaissance? The answer lies in the very pressure of that control. By setting such a high bar for technical mastery, the guilds created an environment where incremental improvements were constantly being made, each new generation of masters building upon the secret knowledge of the last. The guild system demonstrates that commerce and community are not separate spheres, but two threads woven together into a single, durable fabric, proving that the most stable economies are often those built on a foundation of shared skill and mutual obligation. A single bowl of tea can become a portal to an entire philosophy. Within the small, humble space of the chashitsu, the Japanese tea room, the world outside ceases to exist. The entryway itself, the nijirigachi, is a small square crawl space, forcing every guest, whether a powerful samurai or a wealthy merchant, to bow and enter on equal terms, leaving their status and swords outside. This is the world of Chado, the way of tea, a practice where the simple act of preparing a drink is elevated into a moving meditation. The ceremony is a choreography of grace, with every gesture, from the folding of the silk cloth to the precise whisking of the vibrant green matcha, performed with an unwavering mindfulness. Nothing is accidental. The choice of the ceramic tea bowl with its deliberate imperfections, the single scroll in the alcove, the simple flower arrangement, all are carefully selected by the host to create a specific, harmonious atmosphere for that one unrepeatable gathering. This art form was perfected by masters like Sen no Rikyu, who championed the aesthetic of wabi-sabi, finding profound beauty in asymmetry, simplicity, and the weathered marks of age. The entire ritual is built upon 4 pillars: harmony between guest and host, respect for all things, purity of heart and action, and the deep tranquility that arises from their perfect execution. When a samurai participated in the tea ceremony, it was a direct extension of his Bushido training. The same focus required to draw a sword in a single, flawless motion was now applied to pouring hot water into a bowl. It was a way to temper the warrior's spirit, to cultivate a mind that could remain perfectly calm and present amidst the chaos of life or the stillness of the terroom. For the rising merchant class, mastery of the tea ceremony was a badge of cultural refinement, a way to demonstrate a sophistication that went beyond mere wealth. The ceremony became a silent language of aesthetics and ethics, a shared cultural code that defined Japanese sensibility for centuries. How could the meticulous steps of making tea become a path to enlightenment? It teaches us that the grandest truths are often hidden not in complex doctrines, but in the mindful performance of a simple, everyday act. The king of Babylon, the most powerful man in the world, is about to be publicly humiliated. For 11 days, the city has throbbed with the energy of the Akitu festival, a 12-day New Year celebration that was far more than a party. It was the annual recalibration of the entire universe, a ritual so vital that the kingdom's very survival was thought to depend on its correct performance. The entire society participated in a grand procession, carrying the statues of the gods from outlying temples to the central shrine of Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon. This journey mirrored the gathering of the Divine Assembly, a reunion that set the stage for the most dramatic political theater ever devised. On the 5th day, the king, dressed in his full royal regalia, entered the inner sanctum of the Esagila temple. There, before the silent, imposing statue of Marduk, the high priest did the unthinkable. He stripped the king of his scepter, his ring, and his crown. Then he struck the monarch across the face. The sound of that slap would have echoed through a stunned silence. The king was then forced to his knees. In this moment of profound vulnerability, he had to make a public declaration before the god and his people. He had to swear that he had not sinned, that he had not been negligent in his duties, and that he had not led Babylon into ruin. This was not a confession of guilt, but a ritual assertion of his righteousness, a plea for validation. The high priest, acting as the voice of the god, then responded with words of reassurance, returning the king's symbols of office. With that, his power was not just restored, but miraculously renewed. The divine mandate for another year of his rule was officially granted. This astonishing ceremony was a brilliant psychological and political safety valve. It was a powerful public check on absolute power, a reminder to the king himself that he was not above the law, but subject to a higher, divine authority. His rule was conditional, dependent on the perceived favor of the gods and the skillful performance of his priestly partners. The festival then culminated in a grand symbolic battle, a reenactment of Marduk's primordial victory over the chaos monster Tiamat, which, according to myth, created the world from her dismembered body. The king's renewed authority was thus directly tied to this cosmic victory. His political order was not separate from the natural order, it was an extension of it. By ritually defeating chaos each year, the king and his people reaffirmed their place in a harmonious cosmos, proving that the most stable thrones are those that are periodically and publicly shaken. In the stark, unforgiving cold of the Arctic, survival depended on absolute social cohesion. A single grudge held between two hunters could fracture the delicate cooperation that kept an entire Inuit community alive through the long winter. Here, justice could not be delivered with a prison cell or a blade. It was settled with a song. When a conflict arose, a dispute over a borrowed kayak, an accusation of theft, an insult between families, the community would gather for a song duel. The aggrieved parties, the accuser and the accused, would not brawl or hire lawyers. Instead, they became composers and performers, each crafting a detailed, mocking song about the other. These were not simple insults shouted in anger. They were intricate poetic creations set to the rhythm of a traditional drum, designed to highlight the other's foolishness, cowardice, or personal failings with devastating wit and humor. The entire community formed the audience and the jury, their reactions, their laughter, their groans, their applause becoming the true measure of the performance. The goal was not to prove an objective truth beyond a reasonable doubt. The winner was the person who delivered the most clever, the most entertaining, the most memorable performance. By skillfully turning a bitter grievance into a shared communal spectacle, the performer demonstrated a more valuable social skill than simply being in the right. They showed the ability to transform conflict into culture. Once the final note was sung and the laughter subsided, the matter was considered closed. The public airing, the catharsis of the performance, and the judgment of the crowd drained the conflict of its destructive power. The song duel was a brilliant psychological mechanism. It understood that sometimes the need for a community to laugh together is more important than the need to punish an individual. It valued social harmony over absolute fault, resolving disputes not by determining who was right, but by reminding everyone that they were all in it together. How many modern conflicts could be dissolved not by a gavel, but by the healing power of a well-crafted punchline? A boy of 7 is ripped from his mother's arms, his childhood officially over. This was the first brutal lesson of the Spartan agoge, a state-mandated education system whose sole purpose was to manufacture the perfect soldier. From that moment, the boy belonged not to his family, but to Sparta. He was plunged into a communal barracks, one unit in a pack of boys who would be his only family for the next 13 years. Comfort was the enemy, discipline was the only guard. The boys were given a single, coarse garment to wear for an entire year, regardless of the bitter cold. They were fed meager, deliberately insufficient rations, a calculated deprivation designed to force a single, critical survival skill: theft. Stealing food was not just tolerated, it was encouraged. But there was one unforgivable sin: getting caught. A boy who was discovered pilfering cheese or fruit was not punished for the theft itself, but for his lack of skill and cunning in carrying it out. The resulting flogging was severe, a public lesson in the price of incompetence. This taught them to be stealthy, resourceful, and to operate effectively under constant threat, essential traits for a guerrilla fighter. The training was relentless and often cruel. They were drilled in the complex, terrifying maneuvers of the phalanx, where each man's shield protected not his own body, but the man to his left, forging an unbreakable bond of interdependence. They were forced to fight each other routinely, with contests that could be vicious, all to inure them to violence and pain. The most promising youths were selected for the Crypteia, a secret police force that lived in the wilds, tasked with terrorizing and controlling the vast Helot slave population that outnumbered them. This was the final, dark graduation, a test of ruthlessness where killing a Helot was not murder, but a civic duty. How could a society so systematically strip away the individuality of its own children? The agoge was the ultimate expression of a culture that believed the individual was meaningless and the state was everything. A Spartan mother did not say, "Come back with your shield or on it," as a sentimental wish. It was a stark economic reality. A son who discarded his heavy shield to flee a battle was worthless to the polis, a drain on resources who had failed his only purpose. The system produced a warrior so formidable that the mere sight of a Spartan phalanx advancing in perfect, silent unison could cause enemy armies to break and run before a single spear was thrown. But this fearsome strength came at a profound cost. Spartan society was rigid, artistically barren, and paranoid, constantly fearing slave revolts from within. The Agoge created a perfect, homogeneous tool for war, but in the process, it sacrificed the very humanity it was meant to protect, leaving us to wonder if a society can ever be truly strong when it systematically extinguishes the individuality of its people. From the disciplined ranks of Sparta, we turn to a path defined by the ultimate rejection of all worldly structure. In the traditional Hindu vision of a complete life, the final chapter is not one of retirement and leisure, but of radical liberation. This is Sannyasa, the fourth and last ashrama, a stage of life that systematically dismantles every tie that binds a person to the social world. After decades of fulfilling one's duties as a student, a householder, and an elder, an individual, often in old age, makes a solemn and public vow. They renounce everything: their family, their home, their wealth, their name, and even their former social identity are all formally abandoned. The new sannyasi is left with nothing but a simple saffron robe, a walking staff, and a begging bowl. They become a wandering mendicant, dependent entirely on the charity of others for their next meal, their life dedicated solely to meditation, prayer, and the pursuit of moksha, the final release from the exhausting cycle of death and rebirth. This is not an act of despair or escape. It is the institutionalization of a profound philosophical truth, a socially approved and even venerated exit strategy from society itself. The entire community understands and supports this final journey, seeing the sannyasi not as a vagrant, but as a living symbol of the highest human purpose. By giving up every material possession and personal attachment, the renunciate seeks to strip away the illusions of the ego, to realize that the true self, the Atman, is eternal and separate from the temporary drama of the world. This practice creates a revered class of holy persons who wander through villages and forests, serving as constant, silent reminders to everyone they pass that all our striving for power, pleasure, and possessions is ultimately fleeting. Their presence in the culture poses a quiet, persistent question to every king, merchant, and farmer. What is all of your busyness for, if not for this final freedom? How many societies build a dedicated, honored escape hatch from their own system, openly acknowledging that the ultimate goal of existence lies entirely beyond it? A child's first home was not always with their parents. In the intricate clan societies of early medieval Ireland and Scotland, a boy or girl from a noble family would often be sent to live with another powerful household, a custom known as fosterage. This was not an act of abandonment, but a calculated and deeply respected social strategy. The child was a living pledge, a human thread woven between two families to bind them in a web of mutual obligation and protection. The foster parents undertook the crucial task of raising and educating the child, teaching them the skills of a warrior, the wisdom of a judge, or the management of land. In this new home, the child grew up alongside the foster parents' own children, forging bonds of brotherhood and sisterhood that were considered every bit as sacred and binding as blood kinship. This created a powerful, lifelong loyalty that stretched across the tribal landscape. A chieftain would think twice about raiding the lands of a clan where his own son had been raised, and a foster brother would be honor-bound to come to his foster siblings' aid in times of conflict. Fosterage was a brilliant, preemptive form of diplomacy. It turned potential rivals into relatives, creating a complex network of alliances that helped to maintain a fragile peace in a world organized entirely around kinship and the ever-present threat of the blood feud. How do you build trust between powerful families who are naturally suspicious of one another? You give them the most precious thing you have, your children, to raise as their own. This practice reveals that the strongest social glue is not written in treaties, but forged in the shared experience of childhood, proving that family can be a choice and that the most strategic bonds are those formed around a shared hearth. The thunderous impact of a heavy rubber ball echoes through a stone-walled court, a sound that resonated with life and death in ancient Mesoamerica. This was Olamalistli, the sacred ball game, and it was far more than a sport. Players armored in thick leather padding used their hips, knees, and elbows to propel a solid rubber ball, sometimes weighing as much as 8 pounds with incredible force. Their goal was to keep the ball in constant motion, a feat of immense athleticism, but the ultimate victory was to send it soaring through a single, high stone ring set vertically into the court's wall. Achieving this was so rare and momentous that it often ended the game immediately, an instant legend carved in stone. The game itself was a living map of the cosmos, the ball court representing the world, and the heavy ball symbolizing the sun, moon, or stars in their perilous journey across the sky. This celestial drama had a terrifying, earthly conclusion. Historical accounts and artistic depictions strongly suggest that the game could end in human sacrifice, with the captain of the losing team, or sometimes the entire team, being ritually executed. To our modern sensibility, this seems a brutal reward for losing, but within the Mesoamerican worldview, this was not a punishment. It was the ultimate honor, a direct participation in the most vital cosmic process. The sacrificed players became offerings to the gods, their blood and life force ensuring the sun would rise again, the rains would come, and the world would continue its cycle of death and regeneration. This profound ritual was also a deeply political tool. Rival city-states would sometimes settle territorial disputes or conflicts over resources not through all-out war, but through a game of Olamalistli. The outcome was seen as a divine judgment, a way to avoid the massive casualties of battle while still demonstrating military prowess and the favor of the gods. A king watching from his throne on the court was not just a spectator. He was a central actor in a drama that confirmed his right to rule and his connection to the divine. The ballgame was the beating heart of society, a single ritual where athleticism, political strategy, and religious belief fused into one powerful spectacle, proving that a game could be a matter of literal life and death for an entire civilization. A sacred object can sometimes hold more power than an entire army. In the heart of what is now Ghana, the Ashanti kingdom was forged not by a single great battle, but by the miraculous appearance of a single artifact. According to tradition, in the late 17th century, a great gathering of chiefs witnessed a spectacle that would change history. From a darkened sky, cloaked in thunderclouds by the priest Okomfo Anakai, descended a wooden stool entirely sheathed in gold. It did not land on the empty ground, but drifted gently into the lap of the first Asantehene, King Osei Tutu. This was the Sika Dwakofi, the golden stool. From that moment, it was declared that this stool was no mere piece of royal furniture. It was never meant to be sat upon. Instead, it was believed to house the Sunsum, the very soul and spiritual essence of the entire Ashanti nation. The king's authority did not come from his own person, but from his role as the guardian of this sacred trust. The well-being of the stool and the well-being of the people were one and the same. This belief created a unifying force of incredible power. Before its arrival, the Akan people were a collection of separate, often rival, clans and chiefdoms. The golden stool gave them a single, non-negotiable point of focus, a symbol of their collective identity that was greater than any individual leader. It provided a spiritual foundation for a complex, centralized state, allowing the Ashanti to organize, expand, and resist external pressures for centuries. How can an object that no one is allowed to use command such absolute loyalty? The answer lies in the story it tells. The golden stool was not a symbol of a king's power, but of a people's shared soul, a brilliant piece of political and spiritual engineering that turned many clans into one unshakable nation. The power to banish a man rested not with a king, but with a broken piece of pottery. In the bustling agora of ancient Athens, any citizen could pick up a shard from a discarded vase, an ostracon, and scratch upon it the name of the man he feared most. Once each year, the assembly would decide whether to hold this unique vote. If 6,000 citizens agreed it was necessary, they would proceed, each man casting his personal sherd into a container. The individual whose name appeared on the most ostraca was not put on trial. He was not accused of a specific crime. He was simply given 10 days to put his affairs in order and then leave the city for a period of 10 years. This was ostracism, and its purpose was breathtakingly simple: to surgically remove a perceived threat to democracy before that threat could ever take root. Think of it as a political immune response, a way for the body politic to expel a potential pathogen without the messy and divisive process of a criminal trial. The exile's property was not confiscated, and his family could remain. His citizenship and honor were restored upon his return. This was not about punishment, it was about prevention. It reflected a radical, almost ruthless, trust in the collective gut feeling of the citizenry. They believed that the common man, in the aggregate, could sense the ambition and charisma that might one day curdle into tyranny. The system acknowledged a dangerous truth that a democracy's greatest strength, its openness to talented leaders, was also its greatest vulnerability. A brilliant speaker or a victorious general could easily sway the people, amassing enough personal influence to overthrow the very system that elevated him. Ostracism was the democratic solution to this democratic problem. It asked a profound and difficult question: is it ever just to sacrifice one man's freedom for the perceived safety of the entire state? The Athenians answered with a resounding yes, creating a ritual that demonstrated just how far they were willing to go to protect their fragile experiment in self-rule. While the Athenians voted to send a man into exile for the good of the state, another tradition asks what it means for an individual to consciously exit life itself for the good of their own soul. In the Jain religion, the approach to life's end is not a surrender, but a final, profound act of spiritual discipline known as salikhana. When a person is faced with imminent death from old age or a terminal illness, they may choose to embark on this ultimate journey of non-attachment. This is a carefully considered public vow, taken with the blessing of the community and a spiritual teacher. It begins a gradual, mindful process of renouncing food and water, not out of despair or a desire to escape suffering, but as a deliberate, peaceful letting go of the physical body. The individual remains fully conscious, engaged in meditation and prayer, systematically detaching from all worldly bonds. To the Jain worldview, this is the absolute opposite of suicide. An act of suicide is seen as a violent, passionate reaction to emotional pain, an act that creates negative karma and binds the soul further to the cycle of rebirth. Salikhana, by contrast, is the ultimate expression of non-violence or ahimsa, extended even to oneself. It is a willful, unhurried withdrawal from a body that has simply reached its natural conclusion, a final purification. The goal is to face death with perfect equanimity, to burn away the last traces of karma that might cling to the soul, allowing it to achieve moksha, the final liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth. It is a practice that defines the very core of Jain ethics, a statement that the most significant battle is not to prolong life, but to master the manner of one's departure, proving that the end of life can be its most conscious and intentional act. A chiseled canoe hull cuts through a deep blue expanse where the only landmarks are the sun and the stars. For the Polynesian Wayfinder, this was not a trackless void. It was a living, breathing map written in a language only the initiated could read. The Taniwa, the master navigator, stood at the helm, his entire body a sensitive instrument tuned to the rhythms of the sea and sky. He did not use a compass or a chart. His tools were memory, observation, and a sacred knowledge passed from elder to apprentice over countless generations. His mind held a celestial calendar, the precise rising and setting points of hundreds of stars, each one a fixed beacon in the turning dome of the night. By day, he read the ocean itself. Long, regular swells generated by distant weather systems acted as submerged highways, their direction constant for days on end. A sudden shift in the pattern of these swells could signal the approach of an unseen island, its mass disrupting the deep ocean currents. He watched the clouds, their color and formation. A stationary, greenish tint on the underside of a cloud often betrayed the presence of a lagoon, reflecting its color upward. The flight of birds was his most reliable short-range guide. The Taniwa knew the different species and their habits. A tern flying out to sea at dawn was heading for its fishing grounds, and by noting its direction, the navigator could plot a course toward the land it called home. This was a holistic science, a continuous process of triangulation using a dozen different natural signs, but wayfinding was more than a collection of techniques. It was a spiritual pact with the ocean. The navigator saw himself not as a conqueror of the sea, but as a part of its great, pulsing ecosystem. He would feel the wind on his skin, taste the salt on his lips, and listen to the song of the waves against the hull, absorbing data through every sense. This profound connection enabled one of humanity's most breathtaking achievements. In vessels no larger than a modern bus, these wayfinders discovered and settled islands scattered across 10 million square miles of ocean, a triangle stretching from Hawaii to New Zealand to Easter Island. Each successful voyage was not just a journey across water, but a reaffirmation of a culture's identity. It defined them as a people of the sea, bound by a knowledge system that turned the greatest wilderness on Earth into a familiar, navigable home. How many of us, with all our satellite technology, could ever hope to feel so intimately connected to the world around us? The dusty road to Santiago de Compostela was a river of humanity, a slow, purposeful current of pilgrims moving toward a single, distant star. For the medieval Christian, this was not a vacation. It was a physical prayer, a journey where every blister and every aching mile was a coin paid toward the redemption of the soul. A person might embark on such a pilgrimage for a dozen reasons: as a penance imposed by a priest for a grave sin, as a desperate plea for a miraculous cure from an incurable illness, or simply as an act of profound devotion, a way to walk in the literal footsteps of saints and martyrs. The destination itself was a sacred battery, a place where heaven was believed to have touched earth, whether it was the tomb of St. James in Spain, the relics of St. Peter in Rome, or the site of Thomas Becket's murder in Canterbury. The journey was the true ordeal, a deliberate imitation of the hardship and uncertainty of life itself. A pilgrim, identified by a simple wool tunic, a broad-brimmed hat, and a satchel, would leave behind home, family, and safety, placing their trust entirely in the charity of strangers and the grace of God. They faced bandits on lonely mountain passes, uncertain food supplies in foreign villages, and the constant threat of disease. This shared suffering forged an incredible bond among travelers from every corner of Europe: a French knight, a German farmer, and an English nun, all walking the same path, all singing the same hymns, all united by a common goal. This river of faith required its own infrastructure, and a massive one emerged to support it. Monastic orders built hostels and hospitals along the major routes. Bridges were constructed and roads were maintained, not for trade or armies, but for the souls of penitents. In the taverns and around the fires of these pilgrim hostels, a silent exchange of culture took place. News, stories, architectural ideas, and even recipes traveled back and forth across the continent, carried in the minds and memories of these holy travelers. The pilgrimage channeled the raw, often chaotic, energy of religious fervor into a structured, unifying social activity. It created a physical network that bound a fractured continent together with a shared spiritual geography, proving that a journey taken for the soul could, in the process, reshape the very face of the world. How many of our modern journeys, for all their speed and comfort, could ever hope to connect us so deeply to a landscape, a community, and a purpose greater than ourselves? The power of memory, so carefully preserved in the written text of the Keju, was entrusted in West Africa to a living voice. A griot does not merely recite history, they breathe it into being, their words woven with the intricate melodies of the kora or the balafon. This is not a hobby, but a hereditary calling, a sacred office passed from one generation of jelly to the next. From childhood, a griot in training immerses themselves in a vast ocean of oral data, memorizing the genealogies that stretch back centuries, the epic narratives of great founders and heroes, the complex laws and treaties that bind communities together. They are the custodians of names, and in their tradition, to know a person's true name and the story of their ancestors is to hold a profound form of power. At a ruler's court, the griot was the ultimate advisor, not because they gave opinion, but because they could recall precedent. They would remind a king of the promises made by his great-grandfather, or recite the story of a past conflict that mirrored a present dilemma, offering wisdom drawn directly from the lived experience of the people. In this role, they were a check on authority, a living constitution that could not be easily ignored or rewritten. During a social gathering, the same voice that could recount a 7-generational lineage would shift into a praise song, celebrating the virtues of a patron and solidifying their social standing through the potent magic of flattery. Yet this power to praise also implied its opposite, the power to critique through subtle omission or pointed poetic allusion. A griot could mediate a bitter dispute by reminding both parties of their shared history, of the marriages and alliances that had bound their families long before this current quarrel. How could a single person hold such multifaceted influence? The griot was the glue of society, the human thread connecting the present to the past, the powerful to the people, and law to its practical application. They turned history from a dry list of dates into a vibrant, musical performance that everyone could feel in their bones, proving that a society's most vital information does not need to be written down to be perfectly, permanently remembered. A woman's worth was once measured by the length of her foot. In the chambers of wealthy Han Chinese households, a girl of 5 or 6 would have her feet subjected to a years-long transformation, a process that began with the soaking of her small feet in warm water and animal blood. Her toes, all but the largest, were then bent downward and pressed forcefully against the sole of her foot, breaking the arch. Long cloth bindings were wound around this new configuration, pulling the heel and the front of the foot ever closer until the bones themselves fractured and the flesh began to necrotize. The goal was a foot no longer than 3 or 4 inches, the coveted golden lotus, a shape that could fit into the delicate, embroidered shoes that became objects of both erotic fascination and social envy. This was not a hidden ritual but a public and celebrated marker of elite status. A woman with perfectly bound feet moved with a swaying, unstable gait, a walk that was romanticized as a willowy grace. In reality, it was the walk of a person in constant pain, her feet permanently crippled, her mobility severely restricted. The message was stark and practical. Her inability to walk far or work in the fields was the ultimate proof that her family possessed such wealth that its women did not need to labor. Her body itself became a walking advertisement for her family's social standing, making her a more desirable candidate for an advantageous marriage that would further elevate that status. How could such profound suffering be reframed as the height of beauty? The practice of foot binding reveals a terrifying cultural logic, one where the control of female bodies becomes a direct currency in the economy of social climbing. It was a physical manifestation of a patriarchal system that prized female docility and dependence, equating a woman's physical brokenness with her moral refinement and her value as a bearer of cultural capital. For nearly 1,000 years, this excruciating ideal was passed from grandmother to daughter, a cycle of compliance enforced not just by men, but by the women who saw it as the only path to security and respect. It stands as one of history's most chilling examples of how a society can inscribe its deepest hierarchies directly onto the human body, turning a little girl's pain into a family's pride. Yet the very sagas that celebrated such honor also described a vengeance so extreme it defies belief. According to these ancient tales, a warrior who had killed another man's father might be subjected to a ritual known as the blood eagle. The victim was laid face down, and with a sharp blade, his back was carved open. His ribs were severed from his spine and pulled outward like the timbers of a ship's hull. Then his lungs were drawn carefully through the gashes, spread across his broken frame to flutter with his final, agonizing breaths. The sagas claim this created a pair of crimson wings, a grotesque and living offering to Odin, the god of war and death. Modern historians fiercely debate whether this practice was a literal, historical event or a powerful literary metaphor invented by later poets to convey the absolute depths of savagery. But its symbolic meaning is terrifyingly clear, regardless of its physical reality. This was not mere execution. It was a ritual of ultimate vengeance, a physical poem written in blood and bone. It transformed a dead enemy into a sacrifice, their dying moments a direct communication with the divine. The message was one of overwhelming psychological warfare, a performance designed to be spoken of in whispers, ensuring that any man who considered harming a chieftain's son would first picture those horrific wings. It represents the darkest possible culmination of a warrior ethos, where personal honor was so absolute that its restoration required not just killing an enemy, but turning their body into a sacred, monstrous artifact. How far will a culture go to make an abstract concept like honor terrifyingly, undeniably real? The blood eagle, whether fact or nightmare, stands as the grim answer. A body is folded into the earth as if returned to the womb. In the fertile Po Valley of Bronze Age Italy, the Terramare culture did not send their dead away to distant cemeteries. They buried them at home. The practice was intimate and deliberate. An individual was carefully arranged in a seated or crouched position, knees drawn up to the chest, and then placed inside a large, unglazed ceramic urn, a vessel normally used for storing grain or oil. This was an end jar burial, a final housing within a container of everyday life. The great jar was then lowered into a pit, often right within the boundaries of the settlement, nestled among the houses of the living. This was not an act of disposal, but one of integration. It speaks of a world view where death was not a severance but a change of state. The deceased was not gone but repositioned, folded back into the domestic landscape. The symbolism is powerful. The crouched posture mimics a child in the womb, suggesting a profound belief in a cycle of rebirth, a return to the source. The use of a storage jar reinforces this, as if the body was being preserved like a precious seed, its essence protected and contained, waiting for its next phase of existence. By keeping their ancestors physically close, the living community maintained a constant, tangible connection to the past. These buried urns were not hidden away and forgotten. They were likely markers, known and respected, their presence a silent testament to the generations that had built the village. The dead remained part of the social and spiritual fabric, their proximity offering a sense of continuity and protection. How does a society decide where the dead truly belong? For the Terramare, the answer was simple. They belonged right here, among the living, sheltered in the very vessels that sustained life, a quiet promise that the line between this world and the next was thinner than we might think. The most powerful wedding in the world required no bride, only a ring and the open water. Each year on Ascension Day, the Doge of Venice, robed in cloth of gold, would lead a magnificent procession of nobles and foreign ambassadors to the docks. There they boarded the Bucentaur, a floating palace so ornate it seemed more myth than vessel, its gilded carvings shimmering against the lagoon. The great ship, accompanied by a flotilla of thousands of smaller craft, sailed out to the channel of the Lido, where the Venetian lagoon met the vastness of the Adriatic Sea. In a solemn ceremony, the Doge would cast a golden ring, blessed by the patriarch, into the depths, pronouncing the sacred vow, "We wed thee, O sea, in token of our true and perpetual dominion." This was the Sposalizio del Mare, the marriage of the sea, and it was far more than a quaint tradition. It was the annual renewal of a social contract written not on parchment, but on the waves. Venice was a city with no farmland, no natural resources beyond salt and fish, and a population crammed onto a cluster of muddy islands. Its entire existence, its staggering wealth and political might, flowed from one source, its mastery of maritime trade routes. This ritual was the brilliant, symbolic engine of that reality. By marrying the sea, the Republic transformed a simple geographic and economic fact into a divine, unbreakable bond. The sea was not just a territory to be controlled, it was a partner, a spouse. This framing shifted the entire psychology of the state. Dominion was not depicted as brutal exploitation, but as a sacred, mutual obligation. The prosperity of Venice and the fertility of the sea were intertwined in a holy union, blessed by the Church and witnessed by the entire world. It was the ultimate piece of political theater, a spectacle designed for both domestic and international audiences. For the Venetian people, it reinforced a collective identity as a chosen people of the water, their destiny inextricably linked to the navy and the merchant fleet. For rival powers watching from their embassies on the Bucentaur, it was a stark, unmissable reminder of Venetian sovereignty, a claim to legitimacy that was both spiritual and legal. How does a society without an empire on land convince itself and others of its right to rule an empire of water? It writes a love story and renews its vows every single year. The sound of fists meeting flesh echoes across a high Andean plateau, a rhythmic offering to the earth itself. In the thin, cold air of Bolivia, communities gather for the annual Tinku festival, a ritual where violence and sacred purpose are inextricably linked. Men and sometimes women from rival villages meet on a designated field. their faces set with a fierce determination that outsiders might mistake for pure hatred. They engage in brutal hand-to-hand combat, fighting with rocks sometimes clenched in their fists, the clashes often leaving participants bloodied, bruised, and on rare and tragic occasions dead. This is not a brawl born of modern gang rivalries or personal vendettas. It is a deeply traditional ceremonial act, a physical prayer directed at Pachamama, Mother Earth. The blood that spills onto the dry soil is not wasted. It is a vital libation, a necessary sacrifice believed to fertilize the land and ensure a bountiful harvest in the coming year. The participants are not merely fighters, they are intermediaries channeling their own physical suffering into a cosmic transaction that sustains their entire world. But the ritual serves a second, equally vital function on the human plane. In regions where resources are scarce and historical grievances run deep, the Tinku provides a controlled, time-bound outlet for inter-village tensions. Instead of these pressures simmering throughout the year and erupting into unpredictable, all-out feuds, they are funneled into this single, sanctioned event. The community agrees to the rules, the location, and the time. After the fighting concludes, often with no clear winner declared, the participants from opposing sides will frequently eat and drink together, their conflict ritually purged. The shared experience of the fight, the mutual offering of pain and blood, forges a powerful, paradoxical bond. They are not enemies, they are partners in a sacred duty, their collective identity reinforced by the very violence that, in any other context, would tear them apart. How can bleeding your neighbor strengthen your community? The Tinku presents a challenging truth that some societies have learned to manage the inescapable human capacity for conflict not by suppressing it, but by giving it a stage, a script, and a divine purpose, transforming raw aggression into the very mortar that holds their world together. A world of fleeting beauty and nightly pleasures rose from the swamplands of Edo, a city governed by samurai yet secretly ruled by merchants and artists. This was Ukiyo, the floating world, a philosophy of life that embraced the ephemeral, finding profound joy in the knowledge that all things, like a cherry blossom, are at their most beautiful just before they fall. In the licensed pleasure quarters, the Yoshiwara became a gilded cage and a cultural epicenter, where the highest-ranking courtesans, the Teiu, were not merely vendors of affection but arbiters of taste, masters of poetry, conversation, and fashion whose styles were slavishly copied by the women of the city. Nearby, the thunder of wooden clappers and the dramatic poses of actors filled the kabuki theaters. Here, male actors specialized in onagata, the art of portraying female roles with such stylized grace that they became the ultimate ideals of womanhood, their celebrity status fueling a booming industry in woodblock prints. These prints, known as ukiyo-e, were the mass media of their day. They advertised the latest star actor or the most fashionable courtesan, making these figures into demigods of urban leisure. The entire culture was a deliberate aesthetic rebellion. The samurai class, bound by the rigid codes of Bushido, officially despised this merchant-driven world of money and sensual pleasure. Yet they were often its secret patrons, drawn to its vitality and freedom. Ukiyo was the creative explosion of a new social class with wealth but no political power. They could not change the laws, so they built their own kingdom of the night, a floating realm of art, fashion, and theater that celebrated the now. How could a culture so dedicated to transience produce art of such enduring power? It was precisely because they understood the moment was fleeting that they sought to capture its beauty with such intensity, turning a philosophy of detachment into a lasting monument to the art of living. From the ashes of funeral pyres to the silent cartography of songlines, these 41 practices reveal a stunning truth. Beneath their wild diversity lies a shared, urgent human project, a set of blueprints for building a world that makes sense. Every society, no matter how isolated, has faced the same fundamental challenges, the same terrifying chaos of a world without rules or reasons. And from that void, they each engineered solutions, crafting rituals and traditions to impose order, to answer the unanswerable, and to bind individuals into a collective whole. The rigid hierarchy of the Jajmani system and the solitary freedom of the Hanbulsaya vision quest may seem like opposites, yet they are both brilliant adaptations to the same problem: how to distribute roles and purpose within a group. One does it through inherited duty, the other through personal revelation, but both are tools for survival. They are psychological anchors in a stormy universe, providing a script for how to live, how to die, and how to navigate the complex web of relationships in between. The Potlatch chief destroying his wealth and the Moka big man giving it away were both performing a delicate surgery on power itself, transforming raw resources into social capital and preventing conflict through magnificent public acts of generosity. These practices are not random. They are humanity's collective, creative response to the deepest questions we have ever asked. Who are we? Why are we here? How should we live together? Each culture, drawing from its own environment and history, wrote a different answer, a unique chapter in the grand, ongoing story of human ingenuity. And in every case, the ritual was the tool that made the abstract idea a lived, tangible reality, turning fear into faith, strangers into kin, and the chaos of existence into a world you could call home. These 41 unique codes reveal a breathtaking panorama of human creativity. From the Tibetan sky burial to the Athenian Symposium, from the Pacific potlatch to the medieval pilgrimage, each ritual represents a brilliant, localized solution to the universal human condition. They are not random artifacts from a distant past, but the very foundational software that allowed civilizations to boot up and run. They provided the invisible architecture for everything from law and governance to economics and spiritual meaning, turning the chaotic raw material of human life into a structured, purposeful existence. Our own modern world, with its stock markets and social media platforms, its court systems and cultural traditions, is simply the latest iteration in this long, evolving story. The drive to create order, to find belonging, and to answer the great mysteries of life and death remains as powerful today as it was for the Shang diviner reading cracks in a bone. By understanding these diverse ways of being, we cultivate a profound empathy, recognizing that every society is an ingenious, ongoing experiment in how to be human. This journey through time and tradition leaves us with a final, reflective question. What cultural practices, what shared rituals and unspoken rules define our own global society today? And how will the anthropologists of the distant future look back on our unique customs, from the daily commute to the digital community, and decipher the secret logic of our time? Share your perspective in the comments below, and if this exploration into the deep structure of human society resonated with you, please subscribe for more journeys into the mysteries of our shared past.